Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. This week we've been talking about the evolution of our great Navy Yard and how it all began back in the 1820s at a time when revolutions were brewing all throughout Latin America, and when our American government was very fearful that the French or the British might attempt to move into a power vacuum caused by the withdrawal of the Spanish there. And so it was that particular cause which generated action in Washington. And of course that action was step one, to create a South Atlantic fleet which might defend the hemisphere against intrusion, and secondly, of course, the building of a Navy Yard to support that fleet. We talked last week about how Captain Warrington arrived here to lay out the yard, brought in the first people and created the village of Warrington for them to live in, and how he was succeeded by Captain Woolsey, who came on board and continued that work into the 1830s. And we left off last time by talking about how Captain Isaac Hulse arrived here to begin the Pensacola Navy Hospital. We need to further the story just a little bit of what Captain Hulse did, because in addition to having a hospital on base here, Captain Hulse and his people became responsible, at their willingness, to take care of people who were fever victims or illness victims arriving in the city of Pensacola, who were on board private vessels or other naval vessels and who needed medical care, because the city itself had no hospital. So for the next 15 to 20 years, the Navy Hospital took care of those cases as well. Well, the first major activity which the Navy Yard was called upon to care for came here in the early part of the year 1846. It was in that year that war broke out between the United States and Mexico. And immediately the strategy for the American forces was to develop a fleet, a fleet which would also carry military men, and this fleet was going to blockade the Mexican ports along their east coast. And of course, to get the vessels ready for that blockade service, they were to come out of the east coast and to come to Pensacola to be serviced. The bottom work was to be cared for. Anything that needed to be done with rigging or other parts of the vessels, that was to be handled here. And then they also were to be equipped with ship's biscuit for 6 months and a water supply. Well, the Navy Yard people could take care of the physical demands very nicely. But when it came to water and biscuit, they were in trouble, because at that point in time, the Navy Yard received all of its water supply from rainfall, which was collected in cisterns. And the biscuit building capacity there was very small, simply for their own use. And so there was a tremendous sudden surge of activity, which involved a lot of people from the city of Pensacola. But ultimately, both of the demands were met, and Pensacola's Navy Yard passed through. Well, in 1850, the United States had an annual election, or biannual election, and Florida itself had to choose a new United States senator, and the man that they selected was named Stephen Russell Mallory. Mallory was a local man, at least by marriage, and he came to Pensacola on a visit as he was about to go to Washington. And the demand, his idea, of course, was that he just wanted to show the flag, as it were, and to ask people, what do you want me to do when I get to Washington? Well, I think he expected to have a very cordial welcome, a very peaceful meeting, but it didn't work out that way. Because if we had had a Chamber of Commerce back then, the local leaders who would have been in the chamber came to meet with Warrington, with Mallory, and said, look, what we need here is jobs. We need to have our Navy Yard do something. We've been here, it's been there for 25 years. We haven't built a ship. We need contracts to build ships. Well, it took Mallory 6 years before he succeeded. He became part of the Naval Affairs Committee of the Senate, and he worked his way steadily through the hierarchy. And by 1856, he did arrange contracts to build 2 ships. And by this time, of course, Captain Rousseau was now the commanding officer of the Navy Yard, and the contracts arrived. The first one was for a 3,000-ton to be steam-fired vessel, which was to be called the USS Pensacola. It was the first of 3 vessels that we would have by that name, by the way, in the history of the Navy. The second vessel, a smaller one, about 900 tons, was to be named the Seminole. And both of those vessels were worked upon. They were completed early in 1859 and sent on for further servicing up at Norfolk. And by a quirk of fate, of course, both of those vessels came into service against this area once the war between the states began. Well, when the war did begin, the Navy Yard was here, and a lot of people expected great things to happen of it, and the forts and the bay and the new railroad which had just been completed. But of course, when all of the activities of the beginning of the war began, the federal troops seized Fort Pickens, and they never were dislodged. And as a result, the Navy Yard basically sat idle through much of this. It became nothing more than a barracks for the roughly 6,000 men who were to serve here in the armed force under General Bragg. There were a couple of incidents that we would just mention because it's part of the Navy Yard's history. The first one came in September of 1861, when a small shipyard on the Blackwater River owned by the Judah family had completed a vessel which was to be used as a blockade runner. The vessel was moved out of the Blackwater and docked overnight at the Navy Yard, but unfortunately for the Navy, for the Southern cause at least, it was right in plain sight of the soldiers in Fort Pickens. So during the night, small boats off of the USS Colorado snuck into the bay, and the men on board literally burned the Judah to the waterline. And this was the first and only incident of that kind that the Navy Yard was involved in. The other two incidents involved simple bombardment back and forth between the cannon available in McRae and Barrancas and in Pickens, and in both instances, the firefight was begun by the South to their great loss, because the firepower of Pickens was much greater. Well, at the end of the war, there was a great question of what was going to happen to this Navy Yard, because by now, into the era of the late 60s and 70s, it was becoming evident that the future of naval vessels was not going to be in wooden-sided vessels as they had been for centuries, but now was going to involve steel or ironclad vessels, and Pensacola's Navy Yard was not well equipped to do this. So the question was, is the yard going to be discontinued? In 1868, what we came to know later in the 21st century as base realignment and closure commissions, the first of these was formed, and this commission made a study of all of the Navy Yards then operating in the United States. And by some happy miracle, the Navy Yard here escaped condemnation. And so beginning then, slowly but surely, additions were made. The yard was improved, other fixtures were put in place, but not a great deal happened, actually, between then and 1898. In fact, the improvements were so slow in coming that when the Navy began its preparations for the Spanish-American War, they had no plans at all for use of the Pensacola Yard. The one thing that did happen right on the property, however, involved protection, because when war was declared, some of Pensacola's people literally went into a panic. They were sure that there was some sort of Spanish fleet hovering just over the horizon out in the Gulf, ready to attack Pensacola, and they demanded that the Congress provide money to improve our fortifications. So the Congress did. They provided about $200,000 for improving the old forts that were here, including Pickens, and also building some additional fortifications right down on the water with heavy guns that could repulse an invading fleet. The only story that we have about them, of course, is kind of funny, actually. As the work was progressing to improve Pickens, there was a plumber at work out there. He was doing some basic work right on the outside of the wall itself, and his equipment was there. And in the course of his work, a spark from his torch hit some flammable material. It may have been his, it may not, I don't know. But in any event, this fire raced along the ground and went through a crack in the wall. And of course, no one had any idea that there was about 2,000 pounds of powder that had been left there from Civil War times, and a tremendous explosion occurred. Happily for the man, he somehow survived. Windows were broken clear over in Pensacola, and also a large hole was blown in the wall of Fort Pickens. And the next time, as a visitor, you go out and go to Fort Pickens, you'll notice you walk in through not a gate or a wall or a door, you walk in through a hole in the wall. And that is where the hole in the wall came from. Well, the next few years proceeded with very little change here. The Navy Yard had no activity whatsoever in the war, and we did have a modest amount of effort early in the 20th century, because as we moved into the early part of the 1900s, President Theodore Roosevelt was determined that we were going to make ourselves as a country more prominent in world affairs. And he was a great believer in naval affairs. He had been an Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He now insisted that we build more vessels, and they did. And so beginning in 1903, President Roosevelt, at his urging, the arrangement was made that we would have a naval review and training exercise here each spring. And in 1903 and 1904, about 30 vessels, some large, some small, battle wagons and all of the others together, would arrive in Pensacola, and they would be here for about 2 weeks. And of course, you can imagine that the local merchants and many of the local citizens just loved this, because it meant additional traffic in town among the stores and shops of men who were on leave. And both of those exercises were very, very successful. We move into the year 1906, and the great hurricane, of course, struck this area, and the hurricane did considerable damage to the Navy Yard. It was a time of great travail. And once again, a BRAC committee came in and took a look, and the question was, is it worth repairing? And at that point in time, no decision was made. And so basically, things just sort of tottered along into 1908. And at this point in time, we received a new commander here. In this time, he had admiral's rank, a Rear Admiral, Lucian Young. And Admiral Young was a great believer in Pensacola. He was a believer in the Navy Yard, and he did everything in his power to defend it, so that additions would be made that would equip the yard to do more things for more ships of a new generation. But things just didn't work out that way. In the year 1911, still another BRAC commission went into function across the Navy province of the country. They came here late in that year, and I said 1909. They came here and made their full study, and they made their report back to the President of the United States. And Mr. Roosevelt, by his resolution, said, all right, this yard, oh, and Pensacola, they all are superfluous. We don't need them. They are to close. Well, Admiral Young again protested, tried to do his best to slow things down, but it just wasn't to be. And so in the spring of 1911, he called the members of the Chamber of Commerce together and said, I'm sorry, but we might as well make what use we can of our time. We are going to have to close the yard, and my terminal date is to be October the 1st. And so all these things that could be done were done. People were taken care of. Arrangements were made for people to get jobs out on the outside, or some of them did. And then, of course, on October the 11th, the announcement came in the local paper that the Navy Yard is to be closed down today. About 250 people are to be furloughed. They will no longer have jobs there. And literally, the Navy Yard and all of its roughly 1,000 acres are to be put into a naval property reserve. And the padlock is put on the gate, and no one at that point knew what would happen. Of course, no one was, locally at least, was following what was going on with the experimentation in naval aviation. And so people here were totally surprised when on the 14th day of January in the year 1914, the USS Mississippi, along with a tender, the USS Orion, arrived here with about 25 potential pilots and other service personnel. They had on board the vessels the crates that contained 7 aeronautical type aircraft, and they had arrangements for tents that could be put along the shoreline. And so at that point in time, our name changed. It was no longer the Pensacola Navy Yard. Now we became the Pensacola Aeronautical Station. And beginning about the 1st of February in the year 1914, the first aircraft took off. From that point forward, we were no longer the Pensacola Navy Yard. We became the Pensacola Aeronautical Station, and of course the station had other names since then, but we became the cradle of naval aviation, and that's the way the Navy Yard story ended.